So I can't let you go without asking. You mentioned the virus a couple of times, and there's no doubt that the popping up of the Delta has probably thrown many macro traders for a little bit of a loop. The the 1920 style 2020s boom that some people were expecting didn't materialize like we thought. Do you have any thoughts about longer term implications about how this COVID has developed specifically over the last month or two with the explosion of the number of cases even amongst vaccinated populations?
Well, that's certainly kind of thrown a wrench into it. So the fact that vaccinated people can get it as well, which means that there's no clear end game to this,
Right.
other than countries eventually. I mean, one thing you can hope over time is that viruses generally become less aggressive as human immunity develops over time. And so I think it's one of those things. It's challenging because I'm not a doctor, and so kind of I have to look up medical information, look up numbers, and kind of look up the political situation. So you're not only you have to kind of take into account medical situation, then take into account political responses to that medical information. Then you have to look up popular responses to those political
Yeah.
responses, right? Like, will people subject themselves to lockdowns or not in a given country? Some do happily, and other ones protest more aggressively.
Lynn, this is what
And
makes this the greatest game on earth. You get to play it trying to figure out all the multiple levels. So,
Yeah, and so my bias is to kind of look as much possible forward through it,
okay.
and say that I think that eventually humans are going to have to just learn in some ways to just live with this, and so, kind of like how we live with the cold, and that hopefully over time its potency declines to a certain extent. We have seen in some countries, for example, in this Delta wave, cases disconnected from deaths to a certain extent. I mean, the death count was way higher back in early 2020 when doctors didn't know how to treat this thing, and our most vulnerable were hit by it. Whereas now we've kind of gone through this enough that we've had somewhat of a disconnect. I mean, there's some countries where they actually still had a pretty tight correlation, which was concerning. But in other countries, we saw a bigger disconnect, where it seems like the vaccine at least reduces say death rates considerably, especially for older populations. And so, I think over time we're going to have to just kind of learn to live with this.
But so
So
can I just interrupt there? Like over time, we learn to live with it. I agree there. Does it have any ramifications about the trends of globalization, travel? Is there long term effects that you should be as a macro analyst pricing in due to the development of the fact that COVID is more than likely going to be with us for a while?
so I view it as an accelerator more so than a change. And so, speaking of globalization, one way to measure that, if you were to quantify that in one number, you can say, what is global trade as a percentage of global GDP?
Okay.
And so that's tracked by the World Bank and other organizations. And that, if you look all the way back to the 1800s, so globalization measured by that metric kept increasing until World War One. Then obviously we had a big setback to globalization. So we had World War One, then we had tariff wars, and then we had World War Two. So you had this big kind of a multi-decade reversal in globalization, about 30 years, and then starting in right after World War II, we started this another up leg in globalization, and that progressed pretty much all the way until 2008,
Okay.
where global trade as a percentage of global GDP reached about 60%, which is really high. And since then, it hasn't reversed, like it hasn't sharply gone down, but it leveled off and went slightly down. So now we're like in the upper 50% range. And so, in my view, there's a good case that globalization has peaked, and that now we're kind of grinding sideways and talking about reshoring. And one way to put it is that especially the past 25 years, ever since the mid 90s, with this kind of this latest globalization boom, we've really kind of sacrificed resiliency for efficiency.
Okay.
And for a while we were not punished for that, and so that was part of that labor arbitrage I talked about. We said, well, why would we employ skilled American workers when we can get someone in Mexico or China to do the job just as well? And sure, we have some risks related to geopolitical issues and say shipping times and shipping constraints and things like that. But compared to how much we're saving, that's worth it. And so we sacrificed resiliency for efficiency. But that we got so fragile, in my view, that now this it was already starting to cause political issues, right? So the whole populism we talked about, and Trump was talking about the trade deficit before the virus. But then the virus comes along, and we have all these supply chain issues and shipping costs skyrocketing. And if China closes a port, well, suddenly we're like, well, how are we going to get microwaves,
Yeah.
right? So like it just kind of trickles to everything. I mean, Toyota had to cut production of their cars by 40% in a month because they weren't getting enough semiconductors. And you have some countries are reliant on medicines from other countries, and then especially as you have political tension between China and the U.S. Continuing to heat up in kind of this kind of, you can call it a Cold War type of environment. I think there's multiple reasons politically and in terms of just kind of business sense where we're somewhat reshoring. And so that puts a somewhat of a stop, or at least it slows down this kind of 25-year disinflationary trend we've had from that effect. And so we're kind of sacrificing efficiency in order to build back up resiliency. And so that's an argument for maybe stickier inflation than some of the most staunch disinflationists might
Well,
expect.
that's a great way to end it.